be starting on our board member basics. I gave y'all a printout of my slides so they'd be easier to see and so you can draw all over them if you'd like. He's pulling it up.
Because of the formatting, he wasn't able to make it all one cohesive PowerPoint, so he'll have to go and switch, so just bear with a few minutes.
Okay, so we're going to zoom through this board member basics, just some friendly reminders about what it means to be on a historic preservation board in your community. That way we can get to the fun stuff after this, where you guys get to do the talking instead of me. Okay, so these are our commissioner commandments here. These are 10 points that I want y'all to keep in mind that are going to make your lives a whole lot easier sitting on this board. So number 1, and most importantly, that's why it's number 1, read your ordinance. Know how your local ordinance functions. How does the designation process work? How does the process for issuing a COA work? What are the criteria for designation? What are the criteria to issue a COA? How do we enforce noncompliance? Do we have any provisions for demolition by neglect or economic hardship? These are all questions that you can have answered in your local ordinance. I know it's a bit dry, but it does give us a good map of where we want to go and how we do things on our local board. So if you have a question about how things work, going to your local ordinance is going to help you out. Okay, next, and we talked with Ms. Dalton earlier about design guidelines. Knowing your design guidelines, now I know y'all don't have any yet, and that's where we use the Secretary of Interior standards, but knowing your design guidelines are going to help you make what's called defensible decisions, right? So these are the reasons why we do what we do. These outline changes to buildings which are acceptable or maybe not so acceptable, changes that are in character, changes that aren't in character, right? These are what we are going to hold our proposals for alterations to as our design guidelines. So it's really important to know what are the criteria that we're looking for. A lot of these are listed already in your local ordinance, the criteria for issuing COAs. Knowing what you have. You all just had a wonderful survey done of your downtown. It's really important that we know what we have so we know what we can protect, right? Are there any resources that we have that maybe we've overlooked? So any different types of resources, whether they be agricultural or industrial? Is there anything maybe outside of a pretty home or pretty commercial building that we haven't really looked at yet that do have value to our community? So maybe some different neighborhoods or properties we can brainstorm that are maybe a little bit unconventional, but are special to St. Cloud that we might have. It's really important sometimes to think outside of the box as to what's not so normal. Keep learning. That's why you're here today. Thank you for your time. There's a lot of different tools and resources that y'all have, especially as a certified local government, okay? Number 1 is us at DHR. We are always here to help you. We are just a phone call away. Through the use of webinars, trainings like this, and also just reaching out through emails or phone calls, y'all have a direct connection to our office, and we are more than happy to help answer questions or provide direction whenever you may need. With that, there are other organizations out there that do provide training. NAPC, our National Alliance for Preservation Commissions, they issue a ton of great reading resources. They have their forum conference coming up this July in Cincinnati that they do every 2 years. It's like a 5-day conference where we talk about all sorts of preservation issues, new types of preservation methodology, and it's just a really great networking event also. You also have the National Trust at the national level and the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. They can be great resources at your fingertips. Please don't hesitate to reach out to the Florida Trust. We can also help facilitate that at DHR. Educating the public. I know it's hard. This is highly, highly important. Through the use of public meetings, such as this, publicizing public meetings, holding workshops. I know that Gainesville and Micanopy just teamed up to have a historic window workshop, and they had a great turnout for it for Preservation Month. Tons of great events you can throw on for your community to do with your historic buildings, walking tours, things like that, to get people informed, and not only informed, but involved in the local preservation process is going to make it more inviting, more palatable, and less scary, right, when we have all of the information as a homeowner or a property owner, right? I'm not so concerned about what historic means in this community, but rather make it something that we can get excited about. Okay, here's where we get to a little bit of the boring stuff. You guys are an arm of the local government, right? So we need to abide by all of our sunshine open meeting laws. Avoid talking about different applications to another board member while you're not at the meeting. Don't hit reply all on your email. Just being really careful to talk about board business while we're at the board meeting. Making sure that we're working with our city attorney. I'm not sure if your city attorney sits in on your meetings with you, but it might be helpful to involve them with your meetings. So if you have any questions right then and there, they can provide you an answer. And also working with the other arms of your local government to get them involved so everybody's on the same page and everybody's excited about historic preservation, right? And no one's left in the dark. Doing your homework. No one tells you that you do homework as an adult, but sometimes we got to do our homework. Before the meeting, before you even get the staff report, right, we want to look at, if we have a COA come across our desk, what we want to do is we want to look at the building, the proposed alterations, and then we want to make a judgment ourselves based upon how we interpret the criteria. And then I recommend to you looking at the staff report to see what staff says. Right, that way I can get my own idea of what I think should be done and then see what staff recommends. And then maybe from there I might develop some questions or think of something different maybe, and I can bring that up at the board meeting. So I'm not just reading what staff says and then having this preconceived notion, right? Visiting the site if you can. Google Earth and Google Maps are absolutely fantastic. I know we get frustrated when it hasn't been updated every 3 months, but it is a great tool. But if you can go to the site, please do. It's always a little bit different in person, but let's make sure we are not trespassing on anybody's property. I used to live in Scotland, and Scotland has no trespassing laws, which I thought was fantastic. You can walk up anywhere across anyone's property at any time, and no one will tell you anything. It's just you and the cows. Just walk in, it's great. But in Florida, unfortunately, we do have trespassing laws, so let's stay at the public right-of-way, which should be at the sidewalk. Okay. When we make our motions, this is where we come back to defensible decision-making. We want to say what we are doing and why we are doing it, and what all is included. Okay, so it's really important that we don't just make a decision because that's how we feel it should be made, right? We need to base it off of something, whether it be a Secretary of Interior standard or something in our ordinance. This is why we recommend, or this is why we are denying this application. And this is why it's important to have your attorney with you also so they can let you know if this is sufficient or not to back up our decisions. Being objective and consistent. I want to make sure that I'm doing something because I have a reason to do it, not just because I feel like it. We had a discussion about calling buildings cute earlier. While I do think that a significant number of buildings are cute, it is not a good reason to say why I should or should not replace the roof on it. So let's make sure that we are doing something because it is enhancing the historic character, preserving the historic character, or maybe diminishing the historic character of the building, not just because I think it's cute or not. And also, we talked about this earlier, creating a plan for preservation. So there's a lot of different tools that we can use. The survey is one of them, and probably the most important because it gives us a great jumping off point for doing preservation in our community. Then from there, we want to continue on doing local designations, National Register nominations, and then using that information in the survey to make our educational projects, right? So maybe from there, we can create a walking tour of our beautiful downtown and get people more engaged. Okay, I told you it was going to be fast. We're going to get to the fun stuff where you guys get to talk more than me. Any questions? Good call. No, I told you that was boring. Straightforward to the point. All your information is there on your lovely printout. If we could go to design review, I would be very grateful. Thank you. Okay, now I am from Melbourne, born and raised in Melbourne, Florida, so I am your neighbor across the street. There are a lot of examples from here from Brevard County, so please just indulge me. Okay, why do we do design review? When we do historic preservation, we're not trying to freeze a building or community in time. Right? What we're trying to do is manage the change that happens to our significant properties without losing where we came from. So we do design review to do just that, manage that change. Okay? Oh, wait, I didn't mean to do that. What we're trying to do is preserve the historic character of the property. So what makes that building significant? Now, your historic preservation and architecture are linked because that architecture is going to reflect what makes it historically significant or reflect the value that it provides to our communities, right? This is what we call historic character. How do we define historic character? Okay, by this. These are our character-defining features. Things like shape and form, the materials that it's made out of. Is there anything unique about it? What about the fenestration pattern, so where the windows are set out? The roof line, what is it made of? Any fancy or architectural features that are on the exterior? These are the things that make the building what it is, right? Not just where it is and not just what it's used for. Okay. So we're going to do some practice picking out our character-defining features of the building to give us a better grasp of what those are. So can anyone, you can just shout it out. What are some character-defining features of this bungalow in Fellsmere that you notice? What jumps off right off the bat?
The roof line.
Roof line. It's got that classic bungalow roof line, right? Nice and low pitched. What else about the roof?
Got a very low profile and deep porches.
Right. So I have all of that roof overhang, those overhanging eaves to get me shade. That porch in the front screams bungalow. Those columns have been a little bit altered, right? But we still have those columns out front, and that's a big feature of my bungalows. We have the exposed rafters up top that we can see. What about windows and doors? What about those windows and doors?
They look like they've been replaced.
Look, some of them look like they've been replaced, but what about their configuration? Like you see those, I can't count this far. What is that, a 9/1? On the right-hand side there in back, so we still have some historic configuration. All right. What about the setting? What about where this building is? Grassy field, right? What if I put this in between a bunch of condos? Would that change how you look at the building? Maybe a little bit?
Might change the amount of sunlight it's getting.
Kind of defeats the purpose of that porch, doesn't it?
It enhances it. What do you say?
Right.
Extra shade.
Setting's really important. It's something we're going to get to a little bit later, too. That's something we might not always realize is how other buildings around the one that we're looking at can sometimes impact that historic building. We'll see a few examples in a minute. This is the Cocoa Village Playhouse in Brevard County. What are some character defining features of this building that we notice?
The arches.
Arches, those are the most prominent, yeah. Beautiful.
Brick.
Right. Especially the color brick. That's not red brick, right? That's pretty unique. What about that brick pattern I can see in those arches? It's not
It's a very high detailed architectural
right.
facade.
We have some ornamentation on the front. What if I was this property owner and I want to bring more light into my building? And in those two arches on the left and right, I want to make those into windows like they look in the center. What do we think of that?
No,
No.
no.
Why do you say no?
Because that's part of the detail and the beauty of it is the way that they've designed that brick in the
Right.
middle and you're losing it.
Right. Right. So removing that historic fabric, removing some of that historic character.
But I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
On one, it looks like it's an actual window. The other one, is that just,
I
like,
think that's just the sun glaring.
is that what it is?
Yeah, it's not covered up. Because those are the windows into the stairwells. There's a stairwell on both
Okay.
sides,
Okay.
and that's what lets the light in there. I just went to a play there, so. Okay, what about these? These are our Bacardi buildings in Miami. What are some character defining features that we notice?
Well, the tile work.
Right.
The shape.
Shape and form are big. See, this is what we call international style. So the building actually on the left, it's floating. If you can see up top there, you can kind of see the materials that are suspending it. So both of these buildings kind of look like they're hovering a little bit. So that's a big feature. What happens if I were to remove some of that tile work, or were to put an external stairway on one of those? That would kind of ruin the effect, right? Okay, this is in O'Galley in Melbourne, in Brevard County. What do we think about this streetscape here? I will tell you, actually, I just drove by here yesterday, and it's actually changed a little bit. But I really like this photo because it shows you how the buildings interact with each other. So this isn't a cohesive style. The building on the far left is timber, the one in the middle is stuccoed, and the one on the far right is kind of this grand brick building that has a really excellent pizza shop in it. But you see how they all interact with each other. If I were to put, y'all have these wonderful, wonderful arcades and overhanging porches on your commercial buildings. What if I were to put that on that timber building on the left? Would that kind of take away from any other building, you think? Maybe, maybe not.
I think that if it complements the building style of that particular building and you're only doing it in that section, then the argument could be made that it's appropriate because it's, potentially could have been built at that time period. So,
Yeah, it looks like it might have had one at one point.
Yeah.
Right. There was a rooftop bar on top of it, and they put a massive stairway on the side. Would that maybe impact it? I mean, it's not ADA compliant now, but it might impact it. It would impact our shark mural that's on the side of it, that's for
Right.
certain.
if you run the stairs the correct way, optically it might work. You're just feeding the shark.
That's our true goal. They actually just unstuccoed the building in the center, and that's now exposed brick.
I was gonna ask that, because I would say the stucco probably wasn't original anyway, so it would be okay for them to remove that, I presume, as,
Potentially.
If
We might
it's-
need some more
fits.
information, yeah.
well, like in this situation, it would fit, because it would either go with the brick next to it or the siding on the
Right.
other side.
Unless that stucco's taken on some extreme historical significance since it's been there. But it would still be cohesive. I think brick. It would still be cohesive on that street. Okay. So this is how we evaluate our character-defining features and alterations to our historic buildings. Now, I know you guys use the SOI standards a lot, so we're going to cover these a little bit quickly and then get to the practice portion where we're going to use the SOI standards to evaluate a few properties that might be a little bit tricky. Okay? So, real quick, 4 rules. We can preserve, which is freeze a building in time. We can restore, so we can take a building back to, like we were talking about taking the stucco off, so taking the building back to what it was. We can rehabilitate, which is our adaptive reuse, which is what we do mostly with our COA process. Or we can reconstruct, where it doesn't exist, but we knew that it existed once, so we're going to make it exist again. Today, we're just going to talk about rehabilitating our properties. Okay, so what do we want to do when we rehabilitate something? We want to try and retain as much historic fabric and features as we can. Now, I know we live in the state of Florida, and Florida is not very nice to our historic fabric. That's why I say as much as we can, because sometimes that's not possible. Okay. What else we want to do is we want to make sure that our historic character-defining features remain extant, right? Because if I'm missing everything that makes the building special, then why is it special anymore? And lastly, I want to make sure that my changes can be reversible. So I'm not trying to ruin any historic fabric while updating the building or making it usable again. I want to make sure that my changes can be taken off if they need to be. And I'm not going to alter the building forever. Okay, standard 1. We want to try to use the building for the purpose that it was intended. And if we are not using it for that purpose, we want to try and use it for a new one in which we don't have to change it so much. So this is a historic filling station in Tallahassee that they've turned into a bar and hangout area. So you can see that they've kept all of the character-defining features on this building. You don't really need to change a lot in the interior or exterior to make it compatible for use as a bar. They left those big glass doors and windows. Maybe they added some artwork to the outside, but they left that really funky overhanging eave, right? They might have changed the setting just a little bit by adding some seating, but they didn't negatively impact the building when they did that. This is the ice plant in Melbourne, where this is now used as offices for Florida Power and Light. You can see it looks exactly like an early 1900s ice plant, and they didn't do any alterations to the exterior whatsoever. On the interior, they added office space and put in a few drop ceilings, but none of those changes impacted the exterior whatsoever. So while it's serving a new use, I'm not negatively impacting the building. Okay, number 2, talked about this a lot already, so I'll go quickly. We're trying to keep that historic character. Now, what do we think of these pictures? What do we think of the change? Did changing it from 1 storefront into 2 negatively impact the historic character? Did I remove any of the character-defining features of this?
Actually couldn't tell because it's too shadowed.
Is it? Is it on your screen? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's very shadowed.
Some of the window changed.
Yeah.
I feel like it's I mean, it probably doesn't, it looks like it's 2 different eras now. I don't know, maybe that's the paint, or if it's 2 of them, or the windows, but like the one definitely looks more historic, but then this one looks like, not that the 50s are not historic, but it just looks like it's now historic from a different time.
Right, okay. I see what
Actually,
you're saying.
both sides have been significantly changed as I'm looking into
The window.
getting into it, because they've changed the window patterns as well as the door
Yeah.
patterns. Where it was recessed before, now it's flat, so there's been a lot of alteration.
But I have a question for you, because you'll get this question.
Can it be restored?
But could it be reversed? But also, I have 2 shop fronts now instead of 1. So the community is able to have 2 more storefronts where 2 more small businesses can occupy.
I would have
those-
thought they could have still done the recessed doors and still have 2 storefronts.
Okay,
Right.
Okay,
right?
so maybe we can say, based on standard 2, we can't approve this because it's losing the historic character of the storefront,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I think it's the paint on the bricks that make it look like.
Paint on brick hurts me.
I
Bad.
don't,
Keeps me awake at night sometimes. It could be appropriate. It could be appropriate.
Depends on the condition of the brick.
Depends on the condition of the brick.
But
Depends
you
on
could-
what building you're painting.
You could actually have made these, like you were saying, 2 separate buildings, because you have that column in the middle that would complement 2 separate buildings without having done the
I agree.
excessive amount of
Right.
changes.
I think you still could have made 2 separate locations and still kept the historic feel on the left picture, because
Mhm.
it is different on the right. There is a different feel.
Yeah.
It does change the character.
What if we kept, maybe if that recessed doorway had been kept there, that might help a little bit, yeah. Okay, we're getting to the good stuff. Those were great. Those are good comments. I've not heard any of that before on this, on this one.
From an architectural significance, though, if you're looking at architecturally, it was a storefront. And the second floor architecture is not cohesive with the first floor, because where you had that pilaster running up the middle of that building, it hovers in space. It doesn't ground to the ground. So an architect could come in and say, hey, it was a crappy design to begin with. Or you could argue the fact it was always intended to be a storefront. How you divide the storefront up may not be architecturally significant.
Okay.
So there are arguments that
Well,
could be
correct me if
presented
I'm-
to us either way, and that we may need to be able to consider and understand.
Is there any information that you could be provided as a board member that would help you make that decision, if that was architecturally significant or not?
If it looked different before that picture. Because
Right.
even that looks kind of modern, that first picture there.
Would maybe a historic photo help of what it should
Historic
look like?
photos, historic
Okay.
plans,
Okay.
architectural plans, which, good luck.
I
I
know,
came
right?
down from up in the Midwest, and, you go up to Chicago, and you can find plans for virtually everything that was constructed in a 150-year period.
Welcome
But
to Florida.
welcome to Florida. It doesn't happen. You're lucky if you find plans from 30 years ago. So,
Okay, I love these comments. Keep it we're gonna keep going. Keep it coming. Okay, what we're trying to not do is make a false sense of history. While sometimes, maybe not so much in Florida, we know how things were built. What we don't want to do is recreate the history that wasn't there. So on this building you see in this photograph, those top 2 stories were planned to be built by the architect, but never were. And lo and behold, dozens of years later, someone comes in and finishes those top 2 stories based upon the plans that the architect had originally. Now, while it is a beautiful building, this building is designated. Did we create a false sense of history by adding those 2 stories that were planned to be built but never were? That's kind of a toughie. Maybe we could find out why this building is significant. If this building is significant for its architecture, then I am dramatically altering that architecture by adding those 2 stories.
it depends on what the significance of the architecture was. If it was because of the architect, then his original design and his original plans actually would be an argument for precedence and relativity to historic value. So adding those floors,
Ruben likes it.
The issue is there, though, is that when you're doing historic designation,
mhm,
all right, it's about the design that's actually built.
Okay.
Because we don't do designation for paper architecture.
Yep.
We do designation for what's actually built and the impact of that property as it physically exists. And so that's why, this photo's actually from National Park Service training. This was a tax credit project that was rejected by the National Park Service because they tried to make that argument.
mhm.
And Park Service said, nope.
False sense of history.
Because it's creating something that never actually existed. It's also similar to like if you took a a building and, like a box from the 1950s, and you decide to backdate it and put a 1920s style facade on it that it never had. It may look good in a historic district and aesthetically it would be pleasing, but you are creating something out of a whole plot that never actually existed there. So that's where it's important to, when you're evaluating properties under this standard, is knowing why it was designated and what its historic integrity is, right? And that's where the character defining features come in. So that way you can properly evaluate what someone's proposing so that they don't create confusion amongst, you know, the people who may not be knowledgeable about the architecture, just assume that, oh, that's how this place actually looked like, when that may not necessarily be the
Or
case.
just because it looks good doesn't mean that we're not just
Correct.
making it up.
So does it matter the time period that the addition is put on? So let's just say it wasn't on the National Register or whatever, and there's a difference, a smaller amount of time between the addition. Does that matter?
If it's a designated building, it helps to look at the designation report, so we can see for what years that building is, what year or years that building is considered architecturally significant. And then if it falls outside of those years, then maybe we should reevaluate or no. So if this were significant for 1920 and that addition was put on in the 1960s, while that may be considered a historic addition nowadays, it was designated for its 1920s significance. So therefore, that would be creating a false sense of history. Does that make sense to answer your question?
Yes, but what
Okay.
if the time frame is narrower?
If it's narrower and that alteration happened during that time frame, if that alteration happened and if it was designated for its importance in the 1920s and that happened in 1922, go for it. It's a historic alteration, and it contributes to the story of that building.
So is there an example you can give us where that would have been acceptable?
Yes, we're going to get to it. Ruben and I love to argue about it, not to get you excited or anything. Okay, standard number 4. This one can get a little bit tricky, and this is why we do preservation at the local level, because y'all know your community best. So properties change over time. That's the point. We're supposed to use our buildings. However, sometimes when they change, those changes become historically significant. So we were talking about that stuccoed brick building earlier. So maybe that stucco building, maybe it became a music venue that the community really, it didn't, the music venue is a couple doors down. But maybe it became a music venue that people really loved with that stucco cladding on it. And then they just removed it. Well, then it no longer looks like the sweet music venue that I saw all these bands at, right? So,
You're not talking about the vault, are you?
no.
Okay.
It's called Standard Collective. Highly recommend. They do sell cute clothes also.
Is that subjective?
This building here that we see in the center of this streetscape, it most likely did not have aluminum cladding on the exterior, right? However, this has become a really great restaurant in Athens, Georgia that we all love to go to for Sunday brunch. Now it's taken on a different type of significance, right? Y'all know your buildings best in St. Cloud, especially if you've lived here for a long time. You've seen some buildings change and the community use them more. So it's important to look at the significance of a building through that entire scope, right? So we're not just trying to revert everything back to how it once was. Sometimes it's best to keep it how it is because that's what makes it important, right? We're focusing on that significance, not so much if it's old or not. Okay, the next few are going to go kind of fast. Number 5, if it's distinct and special and took somebody a long time to work on and complete, it's probably best not to destroy it, okay, and keep it as it is. Pretty easy. Number 6, we are trying to repair rather than replace. I know a lot of times now we see vinyl windows and vinyl siding come up in front of us. We do live in Florida. If we can save it, let's save it. If we can't save it, we can't save it. But it's important that the stuff we are replacing matches in composition and design and that it fits in. They have a lot of, I didn't tell you this because I was embarrassed. I got fooled by some cedar shingle siding the other day. I was like, that's real side. I can't believe it in Florida. That's real shingle side. It was not. It was vinyl, and they got me. So they have a lot of great alternatives out there nowadays, and they're making really good substitutes. So if you cannot save the material, there are great substitutes out there. It just doesn't have to be that blank vinyl sheet. They have a lot of great wood grain. They have a lot of great cedar siding now. Some good alternatives. Number 7, don't destroy your stuff when you're trying to clean it. Okay, this picture here is of sandblasted brick. Please don't sandblast brick. You keep Mariah awake at night when you do that. So when we're cleaning our materials, there is a way to clean it without destroying it. There's a ton of resources out there that can help you with that. Park Service has a few briefs on it. I forget the number.
I think it's preservation brief 1, how to clean masonry materials.
Number 1.
It may be that. I'd have to double check. I'll do that real quick.
But there are lots of resources out there that can help you. Basically, soft brush and some soap. So don't destroy your stuff because then it doesn't come back. I heard it the best way, that when we are trying to save a building, it's just like we're a doctor with a dying patient, right? So step number 1, do no harm. Step number 2, stop the hemorrhaging. So what's really going wrong here and how can we fix it? But let's make sure we're not damaging whatever we're trying to fix.
Can we go back onto the brick just for a
Absolutely.
moment? Because, from my background being up in the north, I understand the reasoning for not wanting to sandblast brick and stone, and that because when the brick is kilned and when the stone is initially manufactured, you get that edge, that cover that's there that helps to repel water and to keep water intrusion. And the sandblasting of the brick removes that protection, or on the stone, and then allows water to infiltrate and you get spalling. Okay. Not the same issue down here in Florida from a standpoint of spalling, typically because we don't have the freeze-thaw issue. But if you come into a situation, which we have a lot of, which is already painted brick, and in some cases it's painted brick that was painted because the brick was already damaged from a facial standpoint, you really can't damage it much further if it's already damaged and not in place. So I guess the question is, at what level do you sit there and say, well, that standard is straightforward? You just absolutely can't use that method, because once you've sandblasted and painted, chemical and brushing is very difficult to actually get a clean surface to come back in and repaint or to do anything else.
But we don't know how much that brick, we don't know how much that brick is deteriorated behind that paint. So what happens when we sandblast it and then I'm no longer able to keep that brick. I've totally destroyed that wall. And we live in the state of Florida. It's wet, it's humid.
Correct.
If I let any more water in, we do get spalling all up and down the coast because all is a salt.
For instance. So that's when you ask for specifications, right? If they are proposing this, they need to tell you how they're planning to do the work, and what procedures they're going to be taking to make sure that they don't damage the material. There are alternative ways of using some type of abrasive cleaning. If they are saying that the brick is already damaged, they need to be showing you that in whatever application they're presenting to you, where it's like, yeah, the face is already gone. And things like that. We do have very soft brick here in Florida because our clay's not very good and they couldn't fire them very hot because we don't have any sources of like coal and stuff in the state. So they would need to show that in, painting brick, historic brick that was always painted should stay painted. If brick was not painted historically, then it should technically stay unpainted because that brick needs to breathe. That's all tied into this. So Standard 7 is not supposed to be a blanket ban on the technique. It should be, you need to be asking the questions, how are you doing this and how will it impact the materials, so that we can make the evaluation as to whether it is appropriate or not.
Okay.
And if they're not providing you with the information that you think you need to answer that question, then that's when you're like, we need more information, please come back to us.
Okay.
Because, once historic materials are gone, they're gone, right? Nobody's making buff Florida brick anymore the way they did it historically. No one's making Ocala block really anymore. These materials are part of the historic character and integrity of the building. And then when you start bringing in modern materials, integrating them into the historic fabric is really difficult because the material properties are different. Things like new mortars and stuff will actually destroy historic materials due to different ways that they expand and contract and how they interact with water. So that's what this standard is essentially asking you to do, is just ask, how are you doing this and what is the impact on the material? And they should be able to show you their work, right? And it's like, this is what we're planning to do, this is what the specifications are, so that way we can assure you all that we're not gonna end up damaging this resource that we're charged with managing.
Good.
Sorry.
Answer your question.
No, it's
There's
all
no
right.
sorry.
I got to throw it out there because we've got a lot of painted brick, and we've
Yeah.
got instances
Yeah.
where the brick is already damaged. so.
And brick, unfortunately, even your historic brick, we can't get that coloring anymore because they're not fired the same way. So that's why we hit on this standard, because Ruben's right. Once the material's gone, it's gone, and we can't replace it the same way. Standard 8. When you start digging and you find bones and beads and stuff, please stop doing it and contact our office. Especially bones, you have to do that by law. But if you start uncovering some archaeological resources as you're doing development projects, it's best to contact our office and stop digging. The site on the left is actually in Brickell, where they were going to build a giant either condo or apartment, I can't remember which, but now it's become a park. And then on the right is in Titusville, when they were putting in a suburb, and this is also now a park where they had to stop digging. So while we do love our beautiful buildings, we also do love our archaeological history, so let's make sure we're not removing that while we're trying to build some more beautiful buildings. I got 15 minutes. Okay, I'm going to take 20. So standard 9, when we're doing additions or alterations, not only do they need to be removable, but we want to make sure that they are distinct from our historic building. So you can see in this photograph the historic library on the left and then the addition on the right. So it's set back, it's compatible with the original building, but it's not too similar where you create that false sense of history, right? So I can tell that that's a modern-ish addition to a historic building. Okay, and then this standards buddy is number 10. When I am doing new additions, it's important that I could take them off like a Lego block if I needed to, and that they are also set back away from the streetscape, not overwhelming the historic building and not taking away from the historic building's character. Okay, so we're going to get to the fun stuff. I'm skipping this because we talk about it. Okay, here's my cute little bungalow home. Ruben is going to play the role of my disgruntled homeowner. And Ruben is going, well, you don't have to be disgruntled yet. Is that mic working too, or do you want this? Yes. Okay, so Ruben's going to present his proposal for a COA for his historic bungalow.
Okay, I am the owner of this awesome little bungalow. It's, got bedrooms and bathrooms and stuff, but I've got a growing family. So I need to make some changes. It is in a historic district. I've got a corner lot, but that's why I bought the house. I like the history. So let's click up. This is what it looks like on the side. So again, you can see I also have a garage in the back, but I need more space. So we're going to take the house, and what I'm going to do is I'm proposing to add on 2 additions to the sides.
Wait, don't go past that. Oh, okay.
Oh, no,
Continue.
no, this is as far as I'm going to go. All right, so I'm proposing a couple of additions to the sides, because that's, once need the bedroom, and then on the other side we need a little bit more space, and then there's a little extension to the rear that I'm proposing. But we're keeping the character defining features. It's still going to be a side gable bungalow-style house with the front gabled porch space. I'm keeping the windows. I am shrinking the additions a little bit so that they, are not exactly the same on the front of the house. And I'm keeping similar configurations to the windows, and the whole thing will have similar siding. So it should all match together and be a nice little house that will meet my programmatic agreement or programmatic needs, while at the same time staying compatible with the original design of this house as a little side gabled bungalow with a front facing gable. So that's my proposal.
Okay, go back to the plans for me. Thank you. What do we think, board? What do we think of these plans? Does this meet the SOI standards or does it not?
And I'm also able to answer any questions you may have about the proposed
So
work.
the new additions are gonna be set back then?
Oh, yeah.
They're
yeah,
set back and they're a wee bit smaller.
yeah. A little bit shorter so you can still see the original roof line of the house.
I told you these would be hard examples.
I would say my first question would be about the windows on the side do not look to be, matching what windows were there. They're a lot smaller.
Can we see what the windows on the side look like?
Oh, no, the windows on the front are still 1/1s, paired 1/1s.
The one on the other road.
But you're on a corner lot, so you
Yeah,
get more
the
windows.
The corner lot,
That's-
he's
that's-
provided 1/1s, but just half the number, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not quite as symmetrical, obviously.
Right.
Well, we're
Which-
adding a room there. We don't need that style of window anymore.
You might want to argue that as a health, safety, welfare issue first.
So, but then by.
I mean, I'm willing to add some extra windows. That's no problem.
So does that?
I mean, from a standpoint of being able to take it back, well, obviously, if he's going through there, those windows on the existing facade to the east are now being completely removed and decimated. Really not a way to take it back easily.
Right. We're destroying some historic material that way too, right?
And it does mess with the character defining
And we haven't
features of
talked
that
about
side.
we haven't
Right.
talked about the materials, obviously. I'm assuming that he's matching materials with his windows and siding.
Right.
in
We're
his
probably
proposal.
putting new vinyl siding on that. Are we putting new vinyl siding
Hardy
on that?
plank.
Putting hardy plank.
And
On it.
but what's the original?
Oh, wood, but termites.
Termites and rain. And I
Yeah,
don't feel like
no.
painting it every few years.
No. Have you seen paint prices?
It also doesn't seem to meet standard 9 very well.
How so?
We're too close to the existing facade, the existing look of the house. It's supposed to be different and set back.
Right.
It looks the same.
It looks like it was a purpose-built ranch house like that.
Right.
Okay. Any other standards that we think?
You could argue that if he's doing the hardy board and it matches the existing planks in regards to proportion, then the new addition would be recognizable as being something separate, but
Yes.
Okay. I still think, I agree with you that I think the shape and form looks so much like a ranch house and it kind of ruins that bungalow. The bungalows have that shape where all you see is the porch in the front and then the building kind of goes back from there.
we only have one side, so we don't really know as far as on the west elevation, as far as what it is that's being impacted. So
Google Maps has its limitations. I do apologize.
the disgruntled homeowner could have brought a photograph,
Request more information and bring
The
it back.
instructions said 2 photos. I followed the instructions, and I gave you the architectural plans. What more do you want?
Okay, let's see.
Well, see, I would like to know about the front porch railing is completely gone,
Right?
and you're not showing any shutters.
No shutters. And all that lattice is gone as
Right.
well. Okay, let's see what was built, because I want to get to the one Ruben and I argue about.
Oh.
Huzzah!
That was what was. But look, there's a ranch house right there in the background.
That's not even the same house.
No, it's not.
That's sad.
I agree.
Ruben, you're arguing for that? Shame on you.
He's got a growing family.
Well, that's what,
I have 3
That's what they
kids
did?
and a mother-in-law I have to take care of.
So
Well, now I am
You
feeling
should
for
have, you
you.
did the addition on the garage, it would have been better for your mother-in-law relationship.
Oh, probably.
Oh, wow.
It's like you can't even see the old house.
No.
Your
No.
bungalow is gone.
No.
All you really have is the tapered columns at
Yeah.
the front.
Yeah, a historically appropriate addition would have just have been lump everything to the rear and extend it rearwards, because that's what they would have done in the 20s and the 30s if you had a bungalow that was too small. Because that's how internally bungalows are organized. You know, you have rooms right behind one another. It's usually like a bank of bedrooms on one side, and then your kind of quote-unquote public rooms on the other side with the central hallway going backwards. Sometimes they'll do a rear extension and maybe a little pop-up to the rear. We've seen that historically. And there are probably examples here in St. Cloud where you can see where you originally had a 20s bungalow that would probably been like 800 square feet. And then they would have extended it by a bank of rooms to the rear. And then suddenly you're at like 1,000 square feet or something like that. So that would have been something more appropriate. The issue with this is that it is a corner lot. So you have two primary facades.
But wouldn't they need a variance for the one on
Well,
the corner?
Yeah, I mean,
even?
seriously, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's a difficult decision. And, you know, sometimes it all depends upon the materials that are presented. I mean, you guys were asking good questions, you know, what type of information, asking for more details on those missing elements, asking for more photos. Those are all valid questions to ask an applicant if you feel that you don't have enough information. And when you're first presented with this, that's something that you can also ask staff. Is there a way to get additional information before we view this in the meeting?
I would like to add, before Ruben and I argue, that we are not the architect. We are not being paid to design this building. Okay, we are not here to offer suggestions at how this would fit within our criteria. So it's one of those, like, when you say jump, they don't ask how high. You just say keep jumping until you get it right. And you can tell them which standards this doesn't meet. Like, you can say those two additions on the side are not set back. They don't meet this standard. But it's not up to us to tell them how much would make it meet that standard.
Yeah, and that's why a well-crafted motion is really important, because in your motion, that's essentially what you're telling them. You're telling them that based upon the plans you have submitted, your additions do not meet standards 9 and 10 under Secretary of the Interior standards, and therefore we cannot approve this project. And then that tells them exactly what their problem is, what standard they need to meet, and how you reached your decision. And that's also why it's important to have design guidelines for your community, because a lot of times you can anticipate projects like this and provide acceptable treatments within your guidelines that someone can look at and say, oh, this is what they are recommending as a model that they can then follow as they're preparing presentations for certificates of appropriateness.
And that does provide, do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay. That does provide also more consistency in our decisions too, with those design guidelines. So we're not just making it up as we go along, so each neighbor can see what's been done, and we have nice, consistent decisions. Okay. New construction. So this is why we review new construction in our district, like this photo here. Okay, here is an empty lot. So we're gonna look at this new construction that was built here, and I want you guys to tell me what you think. If you squint through the trees, I'm sorry, we live in Florida, you can see the building on the right, and then here's some buildings across the street in this historic district. So these are some modified bungalows, all right? They've been kind of modernized a little bit. I do not know how they fit that building on that lot, but they did. This is our new construction. Now, Ruben thinks that Ruben hates this, well, he loves this example, but Ruben thinks that this is a false sense of history created in this historic district, that this new construction is almost too good, that it looks like a historic Foursquare. I am of the other belief that I feel like there are lots of architectural styles within this historic district. There you can see the colonial revival there to the left, that I think that this building fits in quite nicely in size, massing. The setback looks great. I would have maybe selected different materials on the siding and the windows to make it a little bit more historic, especially that dormer on the top. However, I do think that this fits in quite well, and you can tell that it is of differing construction. This looks new to me. The roof looks new. That porch does not look like a historic design to me, with the kind of hipped roof of that porch instead of like a shed roof.
Actually, just the fact that the porch actually doesn't have steps up, it's nearly ADA compliant, and may actually be, I can't tell in this photo, but I mean, so it's obviously not a historic home unless we just raise the grade all up around the entire site.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's arguments towards it. Just the fact that there's a garage set back into the back, it's obviously not a converted carriage house, so if it were historic, you wouldn't be seeing that because that's not what a historic carriage house converted to a garage looks like.
I love that. No one has said that yet.
So,
I love
you know,
that.
there's various elements in there. You know,
The board did put a few conditions on this approval. One was the 6/1 lights on the windows on the top story. I believe they wanted to do just a 1/1 sash, and they said 6/1 was one of their conditions with the approval. One of their conditions was the setback, so I think it was 6 foot that they had that house set back onto the lot. I'm trying to think of another one. The siding, they did have conditions on the siding, that it must resemble wood.
I think it's interesting that they required a 6/1 when most of the other homes, other than the home next door, most of the other home examples you're seeing didn't have 6/1s. So it's just an interesting observation.
Do we think this is too good?
Not if it's my house.
I think that if they were gonna build, I think that the board gave them some good guidelines, because if you look at the neighborhood, there's a lot of different types of styles. So I think it complements the style, even though it's obviously new, but they kept it within, like a character. They didn't just slap up a cookie cutter type home. There is
Right, right.
some, you know.
There's some
Detail.
character to the building, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I like the fact that they have the metal roof over the porch.
Mm-hmm.
I think that does add a little bit to it, but I think if you look at the rest of the street, if they're gonna build new, I think they've got some good guidelines.
And that seems to be where the paradox comes in.
that's fine.
If you have the architectural guidelines of an historic district, but you want to maintain the aesthetics of the neighborhood, then you have to kind of look at that. Because if they wanted to put a box house like the modern architecture that we saw on the previous slide, obviously that would not aesthetically fit with the neighborhood.
Right, you can build that not in our historic district. Right. Okay, this was our last example. There is one more in there that I encourage you guys to look at, because they're going to make me stop talking to you now. I encourage you to look at, it is the Firestone building in Orlando, and I do think it is a fantastic property, and it's undergone a lot of changes. You can see there some of the conditions on approval, that the building was already altered before it came to the board for the alterations that you see in that photograph. And maybe some of those alterations we think weren't too sympathetic to the historic character of the building. So what do we do if a building's already been altered too much and it comes across our desk? So it's just a really neat example for you to look at. I encourage you to look at the photos and gather your own observations. But thank you, guys, and we're going to get started talking about your National Register district here.
Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you, Ruben, for being my disgruntled homeowner, as always.
I need my space.
I know, right?
The Tonys just happened the other day, so he's inspired. It's 5:03. We'll start the work session at this point in time.
I'll introduce myself. Hello, everyone. So my name's Ruben Acosta. I am the National Register, well, my official title is Survey and Registration Supervisor with the Bureau of Historic Preservation. And I am responsible for the National Register of Historic Places in the state of Florida. And I help Mariah manage the Certified Local Governments Program in addition to my National Register responsibilities. So today I am here to give a brief introduction to the National Register of Historic Places, to you all and to members of the public that have joined us today, because there's currently a proposal that is in the works to do a National Register Historic District for downtown St. Cloud. And as part of the nomination process, we like to do a public meeting so that we can provide some basic information about the National Register program, what it is, how properties are listed, and what it means for property owners within the district to have their properties included within this nomination, and then to answer any questions and to give the nomination authors who are here with us today an opportunity to present on the district itself and the details on how it was evaluated, why it's significant, what properties contribute, what its integrity is, so on and so forth. So I'm just going to go ahead and give the introduction to the National Register. So what is the National Register of Historic Places? The National Register is the official kind of list of properties that are considered historic and worthy of preservation. The program was established in 1966 by the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act at the federal level. So this is a federal program that is managed by the National Park Service, and the federal law passed the responsibility on to the individual states to do surveys to identify historic properties and to actually nominate properties to the National Register. So that's how our office is involved in this process. The Florida Bureau of Historic Preservation is what's considered the State Historic Preservation Office for the state of Florida, and so we're responsible for doing nominations. We also work on reviewing projects that may impact National Register listed properties, those projects that are federally funded, mandated, permitted, or otherwise managed by a federal agency. We review those. We also, within our office, have a grants program. We have the Main Street program falls within our area of responsibility. And then we also do a lot of the legwork when it comes to federal historic preservation tax credits. So the National Register program is important because it essentially established a uniform standard for evaluating properties and determining whether they are historic or not across the country. Before 1966, preservation was almost always purely a local exercise. It was done at the city level or rarely at the county level. A few states had some historic programs, but it came about because of essentially the reconstruction of the United States physically following the Second World War. You got to think that by the 1950s, the country hadn't invested in its built environment for nearly 20 to 30 years since the beginning of the Great Depression and then World War II. And that resulted in the loss of a lot of historic properties as the country starts building interstate highways and funding urban renewal and reconstruction. And so therefore, there was a backlash, and that's what leads to the passage of National Historic Preservation. The National Register, like it says, is the National Register of Historic Places. So it's not just about buildings. We have different types of properties that are listed in the register. Buildings are obviously the most visible and recognizable, but we also do things like structures, which are man-made constructions that you don't live and work in. Things like bridges and canals and railways. Those are all considered structures. Things like boats and airplanes and stuff could also be considered structures. We do sites. These are things like battlefields or parks, beaches. We recently listed St. Augustine Beach on the National Register for the wade-ins that occurred there during the Civil Rights Movement. We do objects. Those are man-made things that are movable, things like statues and fountains, fire hydrants and stuff like that. We are evaluating a waterworks in Palatka that has apparently a fire hydrant that dates all the way back to the 1880s that's still on the property, and so we're going to count that as a contributing object to the potential National Register nomination there. We do districts. Districts are collections of different types of resources. So a community like St. Cloud for the downtown, that would be a district because we have a collection of multiple buildings and potentially some structures and things like that. And then we also do landscapes. We're actually working on a rural historic landscape out in Sumter County, a little African-American community named Royal that we're hoping to get listed on the National Register that preserves its original land use and land division and settlement pattern that dates all the way back to Reconstruction. We're talking about 1870s, 1880s, and we've been able to match the original land patent maps from the government land office to current aerials, and it all matches and stuff. So that's a very interesting project. So National Register covers a wide variety of resources. We use 3 major criteria to evaluate properties to see if they're eligible for listing in the National Register. We're looking at age, primarily properties that are at least 50 years of age or older. We use 50 years as kind of an arbitrary cutoff to allow time to pass for historic context to develop, to kind of reduce the amount of emotion that may be tied to certain properties, to allow for an objective assessment of them, although we do allow for certain properties that are considered exceptionally significant to be listed that are less than 50 years of age. Like, for example, here in Florida, Cape Canaveral, where the Apollo missions were launched from to get to the moon, that was listed only 30 years after the events of the 1960s and 1970s. So that got on the National Register in the late 1990s to 2000s. Once we determine that the property is old enough for potential designation, we then look at significance. Essentially, we're trying to answer the question, why is a place important? And that can be under various criteria. It could be for association with events. That could be either a single event or a pattern of events. It could be an association with a historically significant individual, or it can be significant for its architectural design. We also look at its potential to yield information about prehistory. That's how we list archaeology. Once we know why a place is important, we then try to evaluate, well, can this place tell its story? And that's what we consider to be historic integrity. And that's when we're looking at, is a place in its original location? How has its setting changed? What was its original design and how has that changed over time? What were the original materials that went into it? Can you see the workmanship that went into the creation of this place? Does it still retain its historic association and does it feel historic? We always evaluate integrity based upon significance. So if a place is significant for events, things like location and setting are more important compared to if a place is important for architecture, where the design and the materials become most important. A property does not have to have integrity under all 7 categories of integrity in order to be eligible. We look at all of these things holistically and together, and they're all supposed to work together. And if a property has age, significance, and integrity, we then consider it eligible for historic designation. So an example for property associated with events, here in St. Cloud, we have the GAR Memorial Hall that's associated with the establishment of St. Cloud and the Grand Army of the Republic. It's the reason this community exists. So this building is historically significant for the events that occurred here in the association that used that building and their activities in St. Cloud. A place associated with people is this building. This is the James W. Wright building in DeLand up in Volusia County. This building was constructed by a wealthy African-American entrepreneur in the 1920s during the height of segregation and activities of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was actually able to get a white architect and white builders to design and build this building for him, and he actually operated several successful businesses out of this. He was so successful that he actually presented at a national conference for black business owners that was established by Booker T. Washington back in the 19-teens. And he operated his businesses out of this building through the 1950s. An example for design and construction is this fun little building. This is actually outside of Weeki Wachee out in Hernando County. This is one of the few surviving examples of what we call programmatic architecture or roadside architecture, where they're imitating, art or design and stuff like that to draw in people who are driving by on the highway. This is right off of US 19. So this is the only dinosaur-shaped gas station left in the state of Florida, and we successfully listed it on the National Register for its unique design. It was a Sinclair service station. If you know anything about Sinclair gas, the dinosaur is their symbol. And this was built in the 1960s after Sinclair actually participated in a World's Fair and showed off all their dinosaur stuff. It was really neat, the information we found for that. An example of a site for information potential is this one. This is out in Arcadia. This is the location of Pine Level, the original county seat of DeSoto County. There's nothing that you can see there on the surface. It's essentially an orange grove, but if you start digging and investigating underground, you'll find building foundations and trash pits, the locations of streets and all that stuff. And it's actually kind of like a ghost town that has been lost to history that we listed on the National Register as an archaeological site. Talking about integrity and the need to evaluate integrity based upon significance, these are just two examples. The building on the left is a house in Lincolnville, which is a historic African-American neighborhood in St. Augustine, Florida. And that's an example of a building that has been really modified over time and has kind of lost its integrity because its significance would have been as a residential property during this period of significance. And it had since been changed within the last 50 years into a business that was remodeled multiple times. They added additions. They changed out a lot of the character-defining features. So it's no longer can be considered to have historic integrity for its original design or use. While the building on the right is the Lamont Rosenwald School. Rosenwald schools were African-American schools that were built between about 1920 and 1936 using money coming out of the Julius Rosenwald Fund. Julius Rosenwald was the president of Sears Roebuck and Company. He was an incredibly wealthy man who wanted to use his wealth for philanthropic purposes, and he teamed up with Booker T. Washington to create a fund to promote African-American education. And they built schools across the Southeast. In the state of Florida, they built about 120 schools. We had the fewest number in the entire South, and now we have less than 20 left in the state of Florida. So even though that building is missing a lot of its windows, it's in relatively poor condition and such, since it's still a surviving example of an incredibly rare and significant resource, we can still argue that it has sufficient integrity to convey its significance and therefore be eligible for National Register listing. And I've showed these because it's important to kind of divorce condition from integrity. It's entirely possible for a building to be in poor condition and yet retain sufficient elements of its original design and materials to convey its significance and still be eligible. While you could have a building that looks great, it's in perfect condition, but when you start evaluating it and investigating it, you find out that half the materials have been replaced and you can't really read the original design of the building anymore. And then that building kind of ceases to have integrity and therefore it's not eligible anymore. So that's, in a nutshell, really fast, right? What is the National Register and how do we evaluate properties? So let's say we do get a property that's eligible and we get it listed. Well, what does that mean for the person who owns that property? Well, National Register listing is primarily an honorary program, right? It's a tool that's designed to facilitate government planning and management in regards to government programs, and it is not designed to be a regulatory tool upon private property owners. And it says so specifically in the federal regulations. It states that property owners retain all of their private property rights to modify, maintain, alter, and do whatever they want to their property as long as they're using their own money, right? The instant they start asking for government money, right, in the form of tax credits or grants, then they need to go and start applying the Secretary of the Interior standards and stuff because they're using taxpayer funds to make changes to their property. So one of the benefits associated with historic designation that really applies to places like a potential downtown St. Cloud Historic District is that properties that contribute to these districts are potentially eligible for federal historic preservation tax credits. That is a program where a person who owns a historic property can apply for the program if they are rehabilitating their building. And depending on several other factors that they would need to meet for the eligibility requirements, they could potentially get up to 20% of what they spend on their building back as a federal income tax credit. So that's essentially a subtraction from the amount of money that you owe to the federal government. At the end of the tax year, you get a credit that you can subtract there and save that money. It's a way to offset the cost of owning and fixing up a historic building. For properties that are owned by local governments or nonprofit organizations, if that property is listed on the National Register, they get some bonus points on grant applications through our office. We also review any federal or state projects that may impact that property to make sure that the federal government isn't paying to destroy the property or otherwise negatively impact it. And a lot of times, we are working directly with the federal agency. The people who actually own the properties don't really have to work with our office. That's a government fight. Essentially, we are the watchmen that watch the watchmen, right? We're a check upon the government itself. Lastly, National Register listing does provide some flexibility under things like Florida Building Code and FEMA and ADA requirements, where if you are a listed structure, they give you some leeway because they recognize that that building was built under a different set of rules back in the past, and it may be too expensive or just completely not feasible to do work within that building that meets the same codes as brand new construction today. Now, what we do not do, we don't regulate what people do or do not do with their property. The image up here is for a historic citrus plant that was listed on the National Register in the 1990s, and the rust is slowly eating it away. But there's nothing that says that you have to maintain your building if it's listed on the National Register. We're not the preservation police. We don't go out and tell people what to do or not to do with their property. We don't require you to have public access to your property. There's even a box like for, we've worked with people who just don't want people to know where their property is, and we can just check a box that says their location is not available to the public, and that triggers a set of federal protections that guarantees privacy for properties. So that's basically it. It's an honorary program. It says that you have a special place that is important. It will help protect it against actions by the federal government, but it does not limit what a private property owner does or does not do. Land use regulation here in the state of Florida exists only at the local level. All right? That means it exists only with you all here at the city and with the county, and that's it. We're not involved. Okay? Lastly, how to list a property on the National Register. This is essentially the process that we're going through right now for the St. Cloud Historic District. The first step, which has already been done here in the city of St. Cloud, is identifying potential candidates. This is done through a survey. It involves research and identification of important events and finding out who was important in the community's history. And then we go out and we take a look at what buildings are out there, and we do evaluations to find potential candidates for historic designation. And then in order to do a determination of eligibility, we often ask for what's called a preliminary site information questionnaire, or PSIQ. And that's essentially a one-page form that a property owner or an applicant can fill out that provides us with enough information to essentially evaluate a property to see if it has age, significance, and integrity. If we approve the PSIQ, we then move on to the next step, which is the preparation of a National Register nomination. And a nomination essentially describes a property and argues for significance. It also tells us where the property is, and it classifies it within what architectural styles and such it may have. And it's a pretty comprehensive document with photos and maps and bibliography of research and all that fun stuff. All nominations prepared in the state of Florida have to go before the State of Florida National Register Review Board. It's a board of 5 volunteers from across the state of Florida. They represent 5 different professions. We have a historian, an architectural historian, a prehistoric archaeologist, a historic archaeologist, and an architect. Those are our 5 professions on our board, and they review every nomination to make sure that it is technically complete, well-researched, and well-written. In addition, certain communities that are part of the Certified Local Government Program also review National Register nominations at the local level if the government itself did not prepare it. But if the city sponsors a nomination or it's submitted to us by the Certified Local Government itself, then it's assumed that if they're submitting it to us, then the local preservation board supports it, and we don't require an additional review step. But if Joe Schmo was listing a house down on Florida Avenue by the lake, then they would send it to our office, we would review it, and then we would present it to you all, and you would review it, and then it would go to the state review board, and they would review it. And once all of those people have checked off and said, yep, this is technically and substantially correct, we then forward the nomination to the National Park Service for their final review and comment, and they're the ones who actually list a property on the National Register. The entire process takes between 6 to 12 months. It depends upon the complexity of the nomination, what property that we're nominating, the amount of public engagement we need to go through. But it's one of the few feel-good programs in federal and state government. You know, we are recognizing why places are important and what makes communities unique and special, and really trying to fill out, you know, a lot of what may go unwritten in Florida history. So that's the National Register program in a really small nutshell. I can answer any questions you may have at this moment. If not, I will pass it on to our presenters on this specific St. Cloud Historic District.
I'll open the floor to questions. Ruben?
I have a question.
Sure.
We live in a historic home, and one of the things that we find is a problem is insurance, because, you know, they don't want to insure a home that has asbestos siding, or they don't want to insure a home because the hardwood floors are expensive to replace. And I mean, they can go on and on and on. The electricity, or the wiring, the plumbing. Do you have any?
So what I always tell them is, number one, National Register does not require you to replace materials in kind. Right? There's absolutely no requirement in that. There's also no requirement that after a disaster or any other type of loss that requires a claim, that you bring it back as it originally was. You will not find that in any federal regulation or any rule that guides the National Register program. And a lot of insurance companies do not know that, right? Because they conflate National Register designation with local designations that may be much more regulatory in nature. And that's often found in places like Imagine Coral Gables or St. Augustine, or up in the Northeast in like New York City or, you know, Alexandria, Virginia, or something like that, where they do regulate that stuff, but they're working with resources that date from like the 18th century or earlier. There are alternatives that exist out there for insurance. There are insurance companies that do work with historic properties, that's their primary business. A lot of times I direct people to the Florida Insurance Commissioner. You know, there's a way to file grievances or complaints if you feel that you're being denied for an unfair reason. But the thing is that number one, there's no requirement that government can force an insurer to insure property, right? And then the other thing is, that, I mean, it's just a lack of understanding. And that's where education, and we've tried to reach out to folks, and there's the National Trust for Historic Preservation has some guidance for property owners that are dealing with insurance companies that don't want to insure their properties. But a lot of times if you tell them, look, there's absolutely no requirement that you have to bring it in, and, you know, if you need to replace the asbestos with something that's not asbestos, you have that. You know, we're not going to tell you to hold on to that at all, because we don't want to use historic designation to then make a property unlivable or unusable. That's not the goal of this program. So yeah, it's a difficult problem though, because again, we don't have any regulatory ability to tackle it.
Thank you.
I don't have a question, but I would like to make a statement. Ruben, from the Main Street perspective, because we've kind of been working with the Historic Bureau for a long time. And I just want to thank you because you have been integral in some of our National Registry nominations and working with us, as Michael Hart has with the historic
program.
markers. And I can't say enough about you guys. You really are very helpful, and I appreciate that and want you to know that publicly, that we do appreciate all the work you've done for us. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you.
All right.
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
So how far along is the St. Cloud a historic district in the nomination process.
That's our next
That's
presentation.
it.
Yeah, that's right.
What we're about to do.
Oh,
Right,
right, we're,
Christine was
oh,
about
okay,
to-
good, all right.
We're
Yep.
this close.
We're,
If there's no other questions of Ruben for the National
Okay.
Park, or I mean, the National Park, the National Register element, I'd like to go ahead and move on to the next presentation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, evening, whatever hour it is. I'm Laura Lee Corbett. I first got involved with St. Cloud when I was Laura Lee Fisher 22 years ago when Paula was here and you were first designated as a Main Street community, and we did a resource team visit here and did a presentation, and then I came in 8 years ago to do a presentation and have y'all work towards CLG status and getting a local district, et cetera. And then I came in and did the survey with Christine, and now we're here writing the National Register nomination. And the reason I'm saying all this is because part of the Main Street mantra is incremental steps, and that's how long it takes. So kudos to getting to this point in time. And this, of course, isn't the end, but this is a significant point in time of your preservation efforts here in St. Cloud. I take it you know Christine. Would you like to officially introduce yourself?
At least to the public.
Christine Dalton, Historic Preservation Consultant. I think you all know me already.
And thank you again, St. Cloud Main Street, for hiring us to write this, thanks to a grant from the Division of Historical Resources. Just listed here, this is a historic Sanborn map. This kind of gives you an idea of some of the area that we initially surveyed and then wrote the nomination for. And this just gives you an outline of the methodology that we used to create the research to write the nomination. One thing that we were a little weak in, if you will, are interviews, because right when the shutdowns happened in March, we could not get to repositories, we could not even find a hotel to stay in, and we couldn't talk to people. So one area that we would like more information, and we're glad to be here in this public setting, is the kit homes here locally. That's a part of the nomination that we feel is significant and we would like to capture officially, but we don't have quite the solid facts, if you will, to back that portion up. So if you know any word on the street or send us to someone who knows more about the kit homes, we would certainly appreciate that. Yes, ma'am.
yes, I'm working on a project right now to identify the homes. Today, we went all up and down the streets of St. Cloud. And we picked out several that we think are kit homes. We have actually identified half a dozen
Okay.
that we know are kit homes. And so we're trying to talk to the homeowners and asking them to go up into their attics to see if there are grease numbers and letters on the beams in their house, because that proves that it's a kit home, that they needed those pieces of information to put the house together.
Yes. So we would need that information very quickly because we are on a grant timeline and there is a National Register Review Board meeting in August. And so we are really in crunch time. So if we could get that if you could get that to Christine, we can try to incorporate that into the
We
nomination.
should probably clarify the district, because I know that you guys have gone up and down the streets. Some of them will be potentially in this district, that's what they need right now. And some of the other ones, Olive, will go in the next district that we're now
Map.
applying for a grant.
All right.
So we have to define that line.
We will give you a map so that will clarify that. Okay. So as Ruben mentioned, several buildings are individually listed here in St. Cloud, including the GAR Memorial Hall, the Depot, and of course the Women's Club. So these helped establish some of the historic and architectural context for the district nomination itself. This goes back again to the survey. So we recorded everything that, according to the property appraiser, was constructed on or before 1970. And of course, once we go out in the field, sometimes we find there are discrepancies. We can visually, as architectural historians, see that something was clearly older than identified by the property appraiser. So we surveyed 246 structures and updated Florida Master Site File forms. Many of you are probably familiar with the 1990 survey that was conducted by Brenda Elliott. So another thing that you want to do is update surveys within, what do y'all usually say? 10 years, which I think is very optimistic. But, you know, that survey was more than 25 years old. So Christine and I went through that survey and also identified not only just changes, but what significant structures you had, or even just historical resources that you had lost in that period of time. And then we created a summary of recommendations, and obviously one was to create a National Register district. You already have a local district, you already have local regulations, and we want to stress that the survey boundaries and the proposed National Register boundaries are slightly different, and that goes into what are considered contributing properties and non-contributing properties, and I'll get into that in a minute. There we go. Do you want to talk about this map at all?
So the map that we have actually in front of you right now is just to give you a little bit of context. So this map is the boundary of your existing locally designated historic district. I'm going to show you another map, actually right here. Anything that you see with the purple shading or the red shading is what we're proposing for the National Register district boundaries. So those National Register district boundaries exist within the local historic district boundaries. The reason why I want to point that out is sometimes citizens are a bit alarmed when they hear the words National Register because they think federal government, so they think there's all kinds of regulations that are now going to be applied on them because they're a National Register historic district. Within this boundary, you already have the strictest form of regulations that could be applied within the district through your local ordinance. So having that National Register district within your local historic district, there's no extra kind of regulations that can be imposed. You'll already have that ordinance in place. So I just wanted to state that for clarification because that is something people who are not really familiar with this, that they tend to get confused by a little bit. So again, the preservation district, downtown district, we were looking at here, what we've got some on the south side there that are non-contributing. And when you look at this boundary right here, you'll see it's not a clean box because when we're applying for National Register district, anything that we've determined to be non-contributing, especially if it's on the fringe, we want to have it outside of that boundary. And Ruben talked a bit about integrity. That's what we're looking at when we do these designations, or these determinations, I should say, of contributing and non-contributing. We're looking at significance, we're looking at the integrity aspects and all that Ruben just described to you. So this is a little clearer of what it looks like, what I was just describing to you. So this is the red boundary, is your local district boundary, and all the parcels that you see in there with yellow or purple are contributing and non-contributing. I will also underscore that this document is a draft. So what we've done is we've drafted a document, we've sent it to the state office, we've gotten comments back that we're incorporating into the document that will be the final document that's going to go back to the state before they send it to the National Register Review Board. So I have a draft reference copy here. I actually have two of them for you all to look at. As you can see, it would have been crazy to print out one for each one of you. But we welcome you to look at that. Now, I state that it's a draft because I already know that we've got some errors in there. How errors come about is you read one newspaper article, they didn't get it right. They were in a deadline to get their news article out. And so then you go putting that in a document, and then that document gets cited in that document. Well, when you start digging into the newspapers and all of that, you start finding all kinds of conflicting information out there. That with the National Register nomination, we want to have as little conflicting information and as little errors as possible. To that effect, I want to commend Member Horning, for her work at the museum, because that has been so valuable in working on this nomination. It's really been, my go-to resource. I wanted to call out another person who's actually a citizen that I have not ever met in person. Her name is Larissa Roderick, and she is a local historian, and she has really helped me because she's actually given me specific articles and specific dates, and she's read the whole thing. Thank you to her. And so what I'm doing now is I'm taking all of that information and I'm incorporating it into the edits before we send it to the National Register Review Board. As Laura Lee said, time is of the essence because we are trying to make that August meeting because this is associated with a grant. So I will be working very hard in the next couple of weeks to get those changes in there. I do have a sign-in sheet over here, so I know there's some members of the public. If anybody has any additional information on kid homes or anything that's St. Cloud history within this nominating area that they think should be incorporated into the document, I would definitely like to know. So fill that form out. If you want me to contact you, please put a check mark next to your name. That way I know that I need to contact you. Next. Do you want to go through this or?
Yeah, that's fine. So as I mentioned earlier, we did almost 250 properties that we reviewed for eligibility for National Register District eligibility, and most were considered what we call contributing, and 40 were considered non-contributing. And then several were located outside of what we are proposing as the National Register boundaries. And so for methods of used for evaluation,
Sorry, I have to have this
that's okay.
on.
Ruben went through much of this. We talk about the 7 aspects of integrity, how relatively minor alterations, if there's some vinyl siding, vinyl windows, enclosed eaves, adjustments to the foundation, et cetera, enclosed porches, don't necessarily mean that it would be considered non-contributing. However, there are some that have had some pretty significant alterations. This is one example where the porch has been completely enclosed, has an incompatible exterior finish. The windows are not compatible. The door, all of that. So this would be a clear indication of this no longer reflects its original design or materials or workmanship. And this is another one. We found that the closer we got to, is it 13th Street? 13th Street, I think there's some zoning changes there where it's largely commercial. This is an image from the 1990s survey, and you can see it's this cute little home, and now it is part of an automobile dealership. I believe it's the main office. So that clearly is a non-contributing structure there on the corner of the proposed boundaries. This beautiful building, clearly from a historic photograph, we can see, as Mariah was talking about, you look for clues, and historic photographs are certainly one of those, and we can see this very closely resembles a historic photo of the bank. And then a unique feature that we found in your community are these second-story overhangs, and you can see some of the finish has changed and some of the fenestration, but you can tell this is the same building, right? Okay. And then here's one that's had some minor alterations, and I articulate some of the brackets, I believe, are gone, and some of the windows have been changed, and the porch, but you can see it's the same building. This is an interesting example. Here we have this, what was formerly a Gothic Revival style church that had significant changes early on. And I found this with, found this with a number of your buildings when you went through the, what is your local terminology you use for flora? Spaniflora. Some of these buildings were not very old, but they went through major alterations very early on, soon after they were constructed. But those have taken on significance over time and also reflect this Spanish-Florida style that was being used as a marketing tool to get Northerners to move down here. You know, this is Florida, it's beautiful, and Gothic revival, maybe not so much so. So that's, again, an alteration that's taken on significance over time. Ruben has already been through the National Register criteria. I won't rehash that. But your resources, okay, so what are these buildings we're talking about? So we're talking about homes, we're talking about commercial and industrial properties, churches, and places like the library and the GAR Hall. And the period of significance that we established was from 1909. I assume that's a pretty clear, this is when St. Cloud was established, this is when we officially incorporated, this is when we started running ads to bring in the Northern veterans. Up through 1970, which at the time was a 50-year benchmark, and then you get into kind of the Disney area that so impacted Osceola County. So again, back to historic context, we talk about the Soldier City at the beginning, and then we talk about kind of mid-century St. Cloud, and that's something that Christine and I really teased out in the second survey, which the Elliott one obviously didn't have as much because it was written 25 plus years ago. So we really had to delve into that mid-century significance. I think most of us are pretty familiar with the Soldier, it is called the Soldier City to this day. So we went through kind of that history, and again, Christine was really teasing out some of the discrepancies we'd found in previous research, and so that's an important, I call this a thesis. This is really a dissertation. I like to tell people it's like a dissertation, yes. And we have Professor Rubin here who reviews it. Doctor, yes, sorry, yes. So what buildings speak to that era? So we have the post office, which retains integrity. You can tell it's still the same building. This is significant, 1909. That's the year the community was established. We have several post office, and you'll see these throughout the presentation. We have the early bank, which was later City Hall, I believe. 1911. The Normanhurst, some of you may be familiar with, that was where the Dentile blocks were. Mallet's factory. He had a little block factory behind his home, and his home demonstrated his product. And you can find that his product in many of these down in the structures within the district. The Penflora Hotel, again, bringing in the northern tourists, is significant of that time. And the People's Bank structure, you're probably very familiar with the Ryan and Roberts, the female architectural firm based in Orlando that did some of the, I would really say more, rather than original designs, they did more Spanish-Florida again. They were redesigning to give it that Mediterranean type feel. And then, industrial properties. I love industrial properties because they really tell you about the community, how the community developed, and how I believe you all were borrowing your electricity from another community. And so the more that you were like creating your own, becoming more self-sufficient. And so these buildings speak to when you were, creating your own power here, literally in St. Cloud. And then we go from 1940 through 1970. Again, we talk about mid-century. So we get into the next era of veterans, right? So World War II, Korean War, and you're still attracting veterans to come to this area. There's small, affordable housing. There's no state income tax, et cetera. So this was an attractive place for people to move to. So this, I think it's a bar now, a pool hall. This was the mid-century post office. People actually donated money to put the windows into it, which I thought was quite interesting. And then Quonset huts. We don't maybe think of them as historic, but those speak to, again, a mid-century design. I don't know the origins of these Quonset huts. I've documented them before, and they were probably brought from military installations after World War II. Residential styles, you have several folk forms, eclectic houses that have more formal type designations, classifications, I should say, and then modern homes. So again, kit homes, please send us the information. We would love to get it so that we can make that connection between catalogs, the railroad, affordability, et cetera, and being able to establish that part of your history, the original tiny home, if you will. This is one we think we can pretty much pinpoint, this colonial revival style Aladdin home. Aladdin apparently is one of the identified manufacturers that was prevalent here in St. Cloud. And then mid-century, so we get into ranch-style homes and minimal traditional-style homes, which you might not necessarily think is historic, but these were heavily marketed, again, towards retired veterans at the mid-century. The Brooks Apartments, I think, are a fun design, and it clearly retains a lot of integrity from photos I've seen and descriptions of it before. And that's it. Do y'all have any questions? I know I'm blasting through.
Well, given the time, that's a good thing.
Just to walk you through, our grant deadline is the end of this month technically, and Reuben and the state need time to notify property owners of the intent of the district. So Christine and I are working very hard to get everything accurate and in line with what the state needs in order to present again to the National Register Review Board and then to go on to the feds.
One thing I will add to that is part of that preparation before we notify property owners is we're going through the list that we have from our survey document and just going through it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that everything that we have determined to be non-contributing and everything that we've determined to be contributing is so, and that all the paperwork is in order, that, you know, obviously, this is just a draft. It's 122 pages. The spreadsheets are pretty intense. They've got hundreds of properties, so we're just trying to make sure that we didn't miss anything, that anything's, you know, not classified incorrectly. To that effect, I do have a list here. This is a list of contributing resources, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it out to the citizens that are in the audience first, if they want to take a look at it. If they see anything on here, again, that's a miss, just please, you know, detail on that sign-in sheet, and then I will circulate this all around to you. But that's the next step, so we're putting just a slight pause on the writing and the editing to make sure that we meet that advertising deadline with the state, so that way we're still on track for the August meeting. This is going to be something, when the edits are done too, that I would look to Stephanie to please assist with me with making sure that that draft that's going to go to the state is actually up on the city's website, and that way any citizens who want to review it and read through all those pages have access to it.
Great.
Okay. For the August National Register Review Board meeting, I live in Tallahassee, so I will physically be there to present on your behalf. Reuben is establishing a webinar link that will be available, I believe you said, by the end of the week.
Yeah, and we'll include that on all the notification letters. So if you can't attend in person, when a property owner receives their notification, it will give the meeting date, time, location, and the webinar information on where to register and the identification number, all that stuff. So that's all going to be publicly available, and that will also be on the agenda. Agendas are usually finalized 30 days before the board meeting. And then, if anybody has any questions, they can reach out directly to me. I put my business cards on the table over there, and there are some brochures on the National Register program as well, for people who wish to learn more about the program.
Thank you for giving us the overview. A lot of information. Are there any specific questions from a board? Do we want to have a couple of minutes if there's anybody in the public that has a question that they want to bring up in regards to the nomination? Okay. If not, from a workshop standpoint, I don't have any old business. There was no public comment coming up. I'm going to forego the individual board comments that's on the agenda list because we'll handle that at the end of the next meeting. So that being said, I will go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we'll be trying to get back going on to our 6 o'clock scheduled meeting at 6. So we'll close out.